Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast,
the podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
And now, your host, Dustin Jones.
Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Senior Rehab Podcast. I appreciate you spending your time with me today. I will never forget this one day in physical therapy school. We had an assignment to get in a wheelchair and spend our entire day trying to get around the campus of the University of Kentucky. Very simple assignment. We just had to, be in the wheelchair and then write, a little one-page reflection at the end. But it was probably the most powerful school project that I had throughout physical therapy school because it really opened my eyes to the impact the design of our communities has on quality of life. For me, a fairly athletic individual, curbs, grass, gravel, all those things were not an issue. But then you put someone in a wheelchair and those are major obstacles to overcome. And, I knew that in my head, but I never experienced it before. And it was very powerful. And now being a home health PT, I think the same in terms of the older adult patients that I'm seeing and that a lot of you all are seeing. That, what used to be easy in traversable terrain may be asking for a fall now. It may be a little tougher to get out the door, to walk on the street, to walk across the street, to walk on the sidewalks, and to get on a bus. All these things become more of a challenge. And so I'm very interested in how the design of our communities impacts quality of life and impacts mobility. And there's another physical therapist that is interested in this as well. His name is Chris Hinze. He was on episode 3 about fall prevention. He has been very active in looking at how our streets are formed, our sidewalks are formed, how we build infrastructure to we can either promote mobility or inhibit mobility of our patients, our population, and our society. So we jump into this topic, very useful, very helpful, but most importantly, it's going to get you thinking a little bit and asking some questions on what we can do as therapists, whether it's physical, speech, occupational, what we can do to be advocates to create a more mobile society. So without further ado, Dr. Chris Hinze. Dr. Chris Hinze, welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. I appreciate your time today.
Hi, Dustin. Thanks a lot for having me on.
So you are the first repeat offender on the Senior Rehab Podcast.
Man, what an honor.
It is an honor. So episode 3, we talked about fall prevention, which, you dropped some knowledge bombs on that, and I really appreciate it, as well as many other people. But today we're going to talk about something a little different but very related, and that's universal design. That's community design with everyone in mind, the young and the old. And I figured you were a good person to talk to because I've seen you, tweeting out a lot of tweets about walking and bike lanes and just how, our communities, how they're designed, how they influence our mobility and physical activity. So could you kind of give us the backstory on how you got involved in this topic?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again for having me on, Dustin. I appreciate it. Yeah. This idea of universal design or community design, that supports physical activity, it's been an interest of mine for quite a while, but probably more recently in the last year or so, I was elected an at-large delegate to the APTA's House of Delegates. So that it kind of inspired me to think, a little bit more specifically on this topic and how it might relate to our vision statement as a profession to transform society by optimizing movement to improve the human experience. And the more I work with older adults and especially folks with mobility impairments and issues like that, I'm noticing that they're having a hard time moving around in the community. And so I started to think of, ways we as physical therapists might be able to make that a little bit easier on these folks. And the more I would talk to people about, what are your barriers? Why are you having a hard time, walking places? Why are you having a hard time getting to your bus stop? Things like that. And I noticed that common themes were coming up that infrastructure either didn't exist or was poorly maintained or, it tended to be one of those two things. There wasn't infrastructure for folks to walk or there wasn't infrastructure for folks to bike. And therefore, they were having a very hard time getting any regular physical activity into their day. So I kind of got to thinking, Well, as physical therapists, we claim to be experts in exercise prescription and physical activity prescription. We're huge advocates for that. But what if our patients, or what if our clients, or what if our communities don't have any infrastructure to support people to be active? So that's kind of the evolution of this concept for me, and myself and some colleagues in Michigan. Our Michigan delegation is planning to bring this concept before the House this spring, and hopefully we can kind of encourage some other physical therapists and our association to get a little bit more involved in this arena.
Wow. From what you're aware of, are you all one of the first ones in terms of physical therapy to be hitting this head on?
Do you mean are we like one of the first professions to hit this on, or first group of physical therapists?
Group of physical therapists.
So I guess maybe from this angle, the APTA does have an involvement in the National Physical Activity Plan.
Mm-hmm.
The APTA does have a representative that sits on the board. Dion Jewell is very active with that, and there is a focus of that plan that focuses on transportation, land use, and community design. So they, the APTA and physical therapists have been aware of this issue, but I don't know that we've specifically focused on just community design up until this point.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome, and that's really encouraging that people like you, and many others are trying to address this issue. But I wish, for our conversation, we're just two physical therapists, so hopefully we'll be able to do this topic justice.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be really nice to have, someone to be able to talk to that has experience as a regional planner, someone, that has experience with transportation planning, zoning codes, regional development, land use policy, all those different things.
Yeah, we need, that's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
If only.
Wait, who's that speaking?
Hey, Dustin, this is Matt Martin, senior researcher at the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University. It's funny you mentioned that because my background happens to be in city and regional planning, and I've worked at a regional planning agency, a transportation planning agency, as well as in local planning departments. So I wonder if I can't maybe be of assistance in this conversation.
Oh my gosh, Matt Martin, you are one heck of a guy. Thank you for just randomly barging in on our Skype conversation.
Oh yeah, I was listening in, and I thought, hey, maybe I can come in and give you guys some tools here.
All right. So, listeners, as cheesy as that was, welcome Matt Martin to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Matt he's not a physical therapist, obviously, but he's a very good friend, a good neighbor. I've had several beers and glasses of bourbon with him, and he's very passionate about this topic of just maximizing, the human experience. And he tackles that, from design, from regional planning, addressing lots of different issues. So, Matt, thank you for your time. This is going to be good.
Yeah, I'm glad I can join you guys.
Yeah, so when Chris was talking about just some of the barriers that he heard from his patients in terms of being able to get to the bus stop or even walk on the sidewalk, what, from your experience, what have you found in terms of some of the big issues that we're dealing with in allowing everyone, regardless of their ability, to be able to get around our cities and our towns?
Well, yeah, I should say, from the top that I do come at this from an equity perspective in terms of thinking about needs of the most vulnerable communities, members of our communities, specifically from racial and economic perspective. But, we at the Kirwan Institute, we did a study a little over a year ago about the barriers that older adults face in our community here in Central Ohio, and it turns out that a lot of the barriers that low-income communities face, a lot of the barriers that communities of color have faced over the years, are some of the same barriers that older adults face in terms of just thinking about using like Hinze, accessing services, and just navigating, large regions of jobs and economic opportunities, healthcare, if maybe your transportation means are limited. So it turns out that a lot of those same challenges are at work for older adults as well. And so The study kind of opened our eyes to the fact that a lot of different communities experience similar challenges, and if we, think about those challenges in a coordinated way, in a collaborative way, with all of these communities in mind, then we can come up with some pretty universal solutions.
Yeah. And that's what really excites me when you say, just that collaboration of how, like Chris, you're on this board to address, hopefully address some of these issues from kind of the physical mobility standpoint. And so I'd like to know, like, what has that been like so far in terms of getting involved in this topic, working with several other professions, I imagine. But what's your experience been so far with that?
Are you asking me or Chris?
Chris.
Well, are you asking about my experience, like as a delegate in the House of Delegates? What that's been like? Okay.
Right.
Well, if for those of you guys who maybe don't know much about the House of Delegates, it's a collective body of physical therapists that represent different components of the American Physical Therapy Association. So it's mainly made up of PT professionals with some advisement from APTA staff. So it's mainly a physical therapy related body, but and sort of trying to, because I'm certainly not an expert in this topic. That's why I really appreciate having Matt on to get his perspective here. But I've reached out to professionals in a number of different settings to try to get some, a broad perspective and a more broad view on this issue. And a lot of the themes that Matt mentioned were coming up. Like I contacted a local sort of trail, sidewalk, bike lane advocacy group and just in my community. And the biggest issue that she mentioned was the disparity between incomes. Neighborhoods and areas that tend to be higher income have pretty decent infrastructure typically, whereas neighborhoods with lower incomes and they tend to just lack a lot of those services. So she really highlighted trying to look at it from a universal, like you said, Matt, a universal standpoint where if you aim your policies to try to include everyone and access for everyone, then you're gonna ideally capture the benefit for the greatest amount of people.
Yeah. So Matt, in your study, and this is Central Ohio. So is that just referring to Franklin County, where Columbus, Ohio is?
That was the focus of our study.
Okay.
But in some of our literature review, we were, learning from things that are maybe being talked about in other parts of the country, because of course, populations aging everywhere,
Yeah.
the baby boom. A lot of communities face very similar challenges.
Okay. So in terms of the infrastructure, say like, streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, whatnot, what are some of the things that you feel like need to be done or improved upon, based on that study?
Well, part of what we found was just a lack of coordination among folks who are doing service provision or care or advocacy around older adults and their needs. So this is kind of to go back to your point that you grabbed hold of a second ago with collaboration, is that something that is historic in the city planning field is just the lack of communication between, say, the transportation engineers and city planners.
Oh, really?
Just an extreme lack of collaboration. And so, when highways are being developed, in the 50s and 60s and 70s by transportation engineers, they're not really doing that in coordination with city planners and neighborhood advocates who are, trying to maintain healthy, safe neighborhoods. And so, a lot of neighborhoods had highways built through them. And that, of course, changes the dynamic of how you get around a neighborhood quite a bit,
Right.
So walking might be very different after a highway is constructed through a neighborhood. And so this sort of siloed planning effort thing has been very common. And so what we found is just a need, even within even within the community that's thinking about designing things, caring for older adults, even within that community, there's a lack of collaboration, coordination of efforts. And so one program that we learned about along the way that really took shape as a result of recognizing the need to coordinate more is something called Stay UA, and it's a program out of a suburban community here in Columbus called Upper Arlington, hence the name Stay UA. And it really came out of Upper Arlington's fire and EMS services responding to numerous calls over and over from older adults. And when they would come out, to respond to these calls, it wasn't always an emergency. Sometimes it was, honestly, sometimes it was folks being lonely. Sometimes it was folks needing help with, their gutter or in need of some other service that does maybe exist in the community, but is not, the fire and EMS was not the ideal way to meet that need. And so they partnered with an affordable housing group in town who provides affordable housing to seniors, and they brought on a counselor who helps these seniors connect with the resources that already exist throughout the community. And what this did was it helped those seniors get those needs met and connect with the resources that they really need, all while at the same time saving resources for the city's fire and EMS services. So it was just one example of kind of trying to step back and coordinate all of the existing systems and services in a way that really met the need and was cost effective as well.
Yeah. Chris, what's your experience been, in your work up there in Michigan in terms of, Matt just mentioned connecting, different services and just being aware of all the services. Is that an issue you feel like with some of the older adults that you're treating? Do you feel like they know what's available to them and how to access them efficiently?
No, it's a great question. I think the vast majority of seniors are very unaware of the services that are available in the community to them. And I think it's really important that health professionals, not just PTs, but physicians, nurses, social workers, are aware of as many of those services as possible so that they can connect seniors to these services. And I think, Matt's point about the lack of coordination between, engineers and planners. I mean, I think that lack of coordination exists between health professionals and these much needed services for seniors. And I think just, the more right? You just get out there and ask questions and connect with your local area agency on aging or your local senior center and just introduce yourself and introduce yourself as a health professional and say you work with older adults and find out what services are available so that you're aware to pass that information along to your clients.
Yeah. Would you add anything to that, Matt, in terms of what we can do to try to coordinate some of these services that are available to our older adult patients?
Well, Chris just hit on a couple of the things that really aren't, like naming something like an area agency on aging. We interviewed the director of the Central Ohio Area Agency on Aging, Cindy Farson, and agencies like that and the Franklin County Office on Aging are set up to be sort of the gateway to all of these other services, and they in many ways do serve as the kind of the convener of these services, but so many people don't even know about these agencies or know how to get in touch with them. And so, even just starting by, connecting people to agencies like that who can connect them to so many other resources is critical. But to be honest, a lot of folks, as they're growing up, as they're aging throughout life, they never have to, interact with these sort of agencies. So when they do turn 60, when they do turn 65, and maybe they start to experience health complications, or maybe they're younger and they start to experience these complications with aging parents.
Yeah.
They are just finding out about this whole world of services and structures that exist in their community, and it's really something that should happen before you're in a crisis.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely been my experience in terms of, doing home health, because and it just seems so common now. A lot of the patients I treat, some of the families are pretty involved. Some of the families are, not in town or not involved in caring, for the older adult. And when they get to that point where they need some assistance, I mean, they just have no idea where to go, and it's a scary situation. But there is stuff out there. We just have to connect with that for sure. But also with home health, this is another thing that I come across a lot, is just the issue of transportation of homebound older, just people in general, but being able to go from point A to point B in an efficient, safe, and affordable manner has been terribly difficult in my experience here in Columbus. Up in Michigan, Chris, in terms of transportation, how is that being tackled, in your community?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a good public transportation system in Traverse City, and it's I don't know if good's the right word, but we have an adequate public transportation service here in Traverse City that it services the main downtown, the most dense area of the city fairly well. Connecting areas are not as well served. We have some dial-a-ride services available through that network where folks can call ahead of time and get a bus scheduled, but it's not terribly convenient. There tend to be delays. Here in northern Michigan, we get a lot of bad weather, which tends to impact bus schedules and things of that nature. So it's not great. And here in Traverse City, where I live, and it's probably true of most areas, that the city core is getting a little bit unaffordable for lower income folks, lower income seniors. So they're having to find places to live that are a little bit further out. They're a little bit further away from services, and that really just compounds this difficulty with transportation, especially as they get to the point where they maybe can no longer drive themselves, or they can't rely on rides from friends because they're not nearby. Yeah. So I think we need to think more about that, and it sounds like groups like Matt's are doing a great job at trying to plan for opportunities for these seniors.
Yeah. Well, what say you, Matt Martin?
Well, transit systems are definitely an important asset to have in place. But, I think a lot of times when you're talking about transit, you hear some folks say, well, if we can only have transit systems like they have in Europe, if we could only have trains and, light rail and all this stuff. And it's a point well taken. But the thing about cities in Europe, as opposed to most of our cities here in the United States, is that they developed before the automobile, and they developed in a very compact way, and they're easy to walk around. Their transit systems can serve specific neighborhoods in a really efficient way. But here in the United States, our cities have grown largely based on an auto-dependent society over the last 100 years. And so improving our public transit systems is not merely a matter of adding routes or making our transit routes run more regularly on those routes. It has a lot to do with how can we scale our cities back down to a more manageable scale, and part of that challenge is because of how spread out so many of our suburbs are. I mean, that's a huge challenge, and so a lot of folks are thinking about these days how to retrofit the suburbs and make them more dense, make them more walkable. So that's a lot of the challenge that we face here in the United States in our cities. It's a lot to do with community design and making communities that are not as auto dependent as we've been making them over the last 50 to 60 years.
Yeah. Well, Matt, what is your, and now Chris, I'll get your opinion on this too, but Matt first, what's your take on the impact of technology in terms of transportation, in terms of the Ubers, the Lyfts, self-driving cars, just all these things that are really changing how we get around? How do you think that's going to impact older adults?
Well, it certainly holds promise for increasing the collaboration of resources, so it can serve to, in some ways, make regions smaller. Technology's always played a role in making the world a smaller place. And so, I think some of these things do hold promise for, minimizing the size and scale of our regions in some ways. But, in addition to the infrastructure and kind of the base sort of design of these things, obviously people have to be brought along and versed in how to use the technology, how to connect in the first place. And one big issue is just going to be the digital divide. So, who is going to have access to the resources to be able to connect into these kinds of things as they take off and become a more viable transportation option for folks. So then we have to start thinking about, how do we make sure that everyone has fair access to the internet and has the resources to use that. So
yeah, what would you say, Chris?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how it impacts our seniors. I think probably our most vulnerable seniors who can really benefit from those services are going to be the ones who either have a barrier in terms of they don't have access to the technology or have difficulty using the technology. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 to 10 years how once kind of the tech 2.0 kind of hits that aging bubble, and that demographic starts to adopt technology at scale, what kind of impact it has. I think it's got a lot of promise, and as folks, older folks get more comfortable using this technology, I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I am too. Especially a lot of my patients, they'll have, just basically cabs come to their house, but with the services that they're utilizing, they'll probably have to wait at least an hour for it to get to the door and then to get to their doctor appointment or whatnot. And I just think about the opportunity, like the Ubers and Lyfts, of how you can call a ride and it will be there literally in minutes, depending on where you are, but just see a lot of opportunity with that.
Yeah, and it tends to be a lot more affordable than a cab ride too, which most of our seniors are going to appreciate. Yeah.
So let's jump to homes, buildings. Chris, in terms of homes, have you addressed or seen themes in terms of barriers to mobility in people's homes?
Certainly. I mean, just from the from the design of a home to the layout of a home. The way a home is designed can certainly be a barrier to someone getting around. Stairs for entry, stairs to a second level. Thinking from a just a pure one-on-one physical therapist standpoint, there are a ton of barriers that we have to look at. Is that kind of what you're asking about, Dustin?
Yeah. Just how a home is made, and I think about in terms of as we're building more and more, especially, in the dense urban areas, and, Matt can definitely speak to this. I wonder, are we building them in a way that will be conducive to older adults even being able to live there? Are you seeing that, Matt?
Yeah, we did some work this past year with the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, and they administer the housing tax credit program in Ohio. And so basically, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but most of the affordable and subsidized housing in the country is not developed through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's developed through the IRS, through tax credits. And that definitely is true also of senior affordable housing. And so what tax credit agencies like this that allocate these credits to developers to develop affordable family housing, affordable senior housing, what these sorts of agencies are trying to do in their policies and in their regulation is to encourage developers to develop in neighborhoods that are more conducive to a walkable environment, in places where people can access opportunity and services and these sorts of things. And those areas, perhaps not surprisingly, tend to be the areas that are more costly to develop in because they're more desirable, because there's a higher quality of life. And so that's a big question that's up for debate right now in a lot of our state legislatures is, to what extent are we willing to invest in vulnerable, marginalized communities being able to live in places where they can get around, where they can access the things that they need, be they low-income families or low-income seniors. This is a big thing that's taking place right now, and it was the subject of a very big Supreme Court decision in this past fall's session, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the effort to do this in this way, to develop affordable housing in quality neighborhoods, was upheld. The ability of, this was a case out of Dallas, Texas, the Inclusive Communities case, where the state agency was trying to be able to do that, and legislators were pushing against it. And so it was a case that was big because it preserved the ability for agency and do this, which, again, when we go back to, transit and transportation, not just being a matter of having good transit systems, but also good community design, that this is an important tool that states, that policymakers need in order to create the kind of environment, where seniors even have a chance to, have a walkable environment. And,
So with the planners and all the people that are involved in these decisions in terms of how, streets and buildings and all these things are made, well, first, it sounds like, you mentioned there's not much collaboration between the different parties. Matt, do you feel like there is a role or space for physical therapists to join in these conversations?
Yeah, I think policymakers need to hear from folks who are working with, some of these vulnerable populations. Obviously, legislators can be very detached from that if they're not talking to care providers, physical therapists, any number of folks that are like on the ground working with these older adults and seeing all the various needs that they have. I think you see that example, to go back to Stay UA.
Yeah.
If the firefighters weren't going back and talking to their chiefs, and their chiefs talking to city council and city planners, then they would never have been able to come up with an idea to really meet the needs of the local senior population in a better way.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. I want to ask you all some questions that some listeners of the show asked. So first, I think this one's probably good for Matt to answer. This is from Christina Novak from staveoff.ca. She's been a guest on the podcast before. She said, what are the biggest barriers in implementation for, some of these different programs that try and improve just community design? You've probably already mentioned that before, Matt, but what would you say are some of the biggest barriers of implementation?
I think planners and policymakers, being connected to folks who are working with these populations is one big part of it. Mm-hmm. I think the lack of resources that we put in to caring for older adults oftentimes is a big constraint, a big barrier. And I think it's big. It's a bigger challenge than maybe we'd like to admit. So it's not something that a small fix here or a small fix there is going to be able to. It's not going to be solved easily. We're going to have to think really systematically, very big picture about, how we design our communities and that sort of thing. That's why, the physical therapists need to be involved. And that's why the tax credit syndicates need to be involved, is because it needs to be all hands on deck to really, really solve these issues.
I like that. Chris, this one's for you. Neil Matby, our friend over in England, from, I forget his URL, but he has an awesome blog that he's been producing some cool content. He asked, Pros and cons of bungalow housing for elderly. How can we make life harder for them to keep challenge without making life impossible or unsustainable? And I don't know if we necessarily have bungalows here in America, but I know what he's saying, because I see this too. We want to make a house safe and to where people can be mobile and do the things they need to do, but there's some benefit in challenging oneself. There's some benefit in going up and down the steps regularly. So the pros and cons to making a house harder, how would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, you kind of just spoke to that briefly, but I mean that there are some pros to being challenged. I mean, just as we challenge our patients and clients with exercise, if those folks are being challenged on a daily basis, getting around their home, if they're having to climb stairs, chances are they're gonna maintain that ability to do that considerably longer than someone who doesn't receive that challenge on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So I think from my perspective, at least giving adults choices, giving them options, having the ability to choose to live in bungalow style housing or, multi-level style housing if they so choose. But then if they find that does get to be too difficult, then they have choices available in their community where they don't have to leave their network of friends and this social cohesion that they've developed in this home. They might be able to move, across town where they can still maintain those relationships and be in a flat style home or an assisted living style home where they can still have access to the services that they've gotten used to having in their home.
That's a good point. So, Matt, let me ask you this question. Let's say, we're talking about older adults, we're talking about community design or universal design. If you close your eyes and picture, this dream city, what would be some aspects of that would allow older adults to be mobile and independent and have a full life as long as they can?
The word that comes to my mind is just integrated communities. And, part of the challenge of having integrated communities, whether it's, racially integrated, economically integrated, or age integrated, is that our housing markets just lack sophisticated tools that can help facilitate people from different walks of life being neighbors. I mean, our communities really are built for types of people, and our markets really often hinder that. And so, I think we need more tools in our real estate markets and our housing and development markets so that we can facilitate integrated communities, because the answer isn't for every older adult who can't live in their home by themselves to have to live in a nursing home. There ought to be ways that people can live in community, surrounded by other folks. So I guess my dream, when you go back to that, my dream would be that older adults are living in communities where they have neighbors who are college students, they have neighbors who have families with young kids, and the folks can look out for their elderly neighbors, and those older adults can also play a valuable role in the community in a variety of ways as well. So to me, integrated communities is really the big solution.
Preach it, Matt.
Amen.
What would you say, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can give a better answer than that. The only thing I might add on to that is just, highlighting that integration with opportunities for movement, making sure that integrated neighborhood or that integrated community, those folks have places to get around. And that doesn't mean that every single street needs to have a protected bike lane, but that they do have sidewalks, that there are bike lanes available, that there are parks, that there are recreational facilities available throughout that community. That there's a good density of commerce, of businesses. There are grocery stores nearby. There are banks. There are places for entertainment, so that folks don't necessarily have to get in their car and drive and leave their community to be physically active. They can do it right there where they live.
Man, you all are awesome. Amazing responses. So these these ideal situations or cities, communities that, I think we would all agree that, that's a worthwhile goal. Chris, what should the listener that is a physical therapist, occupational therapist, or speech therapist, what can they do right now to influence the future?
In this particular area?
In this particular area.
Some things that I think can be helpful are first to educate yourself on this issue. I think by listening to experts like Matt, hearing what some of the issues are, but finding out about in your own community, listen to your patients, listen to your clients, open your eyes and see what's going on, see what type of infrastructure exists or does not exist, and educate yourself on what's there and what maybe can be improved on. And then two, I think, one thing that I found has been helpful in my community is building relationships with elected officials right in your city, with local transportation or recreational facility advocacy groups in your community, because they're the ones that are really, they're working on the nuts and bolts of this. And I think where physical therapists can be helpful is maybe helping to identify some of the gaps, maybe helping to tell a story of maybe an individual or group of individuals that's either thriving because of some great infrastructure or struggling because of a lack of infrastructure. I don't think physical therapists need to be urban planners. That's certainly not our role. Yeah. But I think our role is to just try to support the folks that are doing this important work, and by approaching it from more of an individual health perspective and helping just to tell a story and to educate these policymakers on why it's important from a health perspective is a good angle to approach it.
Yeah, and I like how you said telling a story, because those stories are very powerful. When you can put a face to an issue, a struggle, a certain situation, that hits hard for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And Matt is doing that. Matt, could you tell us about Free to Ride?
Oh, yeah. Well, Free to Ride is really kind of the opportunity of a lifetime for someone with a city planning background. So I've gotten to work over the last couple of years with a couple of my colleagues here on a documentary film that is about a story. It's a story about public transit here in a suburban community outside of Dayton, Ohio. This suburban community is one of the places of opportunity in the region. There are a lot of jobs there. There's a new hospital. There's a couple community colleges there, and so folks were trying to take public transit, and trying to access that area for several years. But the last bus stop on this route ended on the other side of the interstate highway from all of these amazing resources. And so when the transit authority sought to put a few bus stops on the other side of the highway so that folks could get safely to work and these shopping opportunities, educational and health opportunities, the community pushed back and ultimately denied the transit authority's application. And it sent into motion, a civil rights investigation that resulted in the first ever of its kind civil rights finding, a finding of violation. I won't spoil the film, but basically it's a story that underscores the importance of access and providing access to opportunities, to amenities. And it also underscores the fact that people have a right in this country to go wherever they want. And you shouldn't have to own a car or be able to operate a car in order to go to certain places in this country. So yes. The sort of the wrestling that happens in this story over who has rights to what places and what resources is an important kind of underlying theme there. And the film is ready to come out. We're hopefully going to be doing some screenings in Washington, D.C. next month. And I'm really excited about it. And hopefully it'll be something that generates discussion and can affect change in the way that we think about these issues.
Yes. And I think it will. You let me watch the rough edit of it, and I mean, it was very powerful, and to know that the stories that you're telling, it's largely, about race and the civil rights issue and just that whole situation, but it's just as applicable to the issue of age and ageism and, just how these things impact older adults. So I appreciate, you telling that story.
Yeah, and there were disabled folks, blind folks, and older adults who were some of the biggest advocates in that story. It wasn't just people of color and low-income people. It was there's a much larger community that has an interest there. Was it
Willie?
Was it what?
Who was the female that I just fell in love with? What was her name?
Willie Ryder is a champion. She's a champion for sure.
Yeah, everyone should watch this documentary just for Willie alone. I mean, she knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, she did.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap this conversation. We by no means hit all the issues and all the topics that we could talk about in terms of mobility, community design, how that impacts older adults. But I just really hope this gets the conversation going, because both of you all are doing great work to really get people to think about all these issues that a lot of people aren't aware of. So let's keep the conversation going. Twitter is a great place for that. If people wanted to ask you all questions or connect with you, where could they find you on Twitter? Chris, you go first.
Sure. Twitter, you can find me at Hinze DPT. That's CHINZE DPT.
Okay, Matt?
At Urban Reform.
Do you have a URL for the documentary?
Right now, it's under www.kerwininstitute.osu.edu/free-to-ride-doc.
Okay, and all the links for their Twitter handles and the movie, and then even the senior research study that Matt, that we all talked about, will be in the show notes at seniorrehabproject.com. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. I know this is a very enlightening conversation for me, and I know it will be for everyone listening as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dustin.
There you have it, folks. Chris Hinze and Matt Martin talking about community design. I really enjoyed this conversation, and really got me thinking. And I hope it gets you thinking as well, as how are your patients getting around their town or their city, and what can you do about that to hopefully change the future of your community. I really, really encourage you to check out Matt's documentary. It's really, really amazing. If you are a fan of documentaries, especially, say, ESPN 30 for 30s, just kind of those documentaries that expose an issue, but really expose that through telling a story, you will love this film. So check it out, Free to Ride Film. You can just Google that and the URL will come up. And their Twitter handle is at free-to-ride-film. All these links will be in the show notes. Go check that out. Also, if you have not, check out the seniorrehabproject.com. Go ahead and sign up, submit your email, and you will get access to our private Facebook group that we have going on, where conversations like this about community design, how can we as rehab professionals impact the future of our neighborhoods and cities. Those conversations are going on right now. So submit your email and I'll add you to that group. You also get a 10% off of purchase of one of the products on the products page, which I've had a lot of good feedback about the shirts that I've been selling. So yeah, check that out. And I appreciate you listening to this podcast and supporting the Senior Rehab Project. Let's keep this conversation going on Twitter. Hit up Chris Hinze at CHinzeDPT and hit up Matt at Urban Reform. And let's keep this thing going. Thank y'all. Don't forget to stay funky.